about how we can turn survey data into action. As Carrie said, we don't want to make this a free-for-all by having all the lines open, but I am very happy to take questions. So please feel free to send them through on the chat, and I will address them as they come up. There are the purpose of this. Well, I'd say that the reason why I chose this topic is when we look out across organizations and we see how companies approach doing surveys, there are a number of things that are out there that are pretty common in terms of how we approach doing employee surveys, which seem to be fairly standard practices. These include doing organization-wide surveys of all employees with uniform reporting, meaning we've got one set of things that we focus on that we try to push throughout the whole organization. In particular, we've seen a lot in recent years talking about measures of employee engagement. It is very common to hold managers accountable for maintaining or improving their scores on a survey, and it's also very common to benchmark against other organizations. So if this looks and feels like the way that you approach doing employee surveys in your organization, you're definitely not alone. The question is, though, are these good survey practices? Certainly the answer to that is yes. These are good survey practices. But if we take it from a different perspective and we say, are they always the right thing to do, the answer to that is no. And that's what we're going to spend our time talking about for this hour. The content that I'm going to be covering here is an excerpt from a book that I've been writing that's going to be coming out in the spring of next year. It's called Employee Surveys That Work. And the book was motivated by taking a look at what the different kinds of practices we see out there in terms of how companies are doing surveys, and recognizing that there are some ways that we need to remind ourselves and perhaps refocus to be able to get deeper impact from our surveys. And there are other topics as well beyond the ones just that we're going to be talking about here that are covered in the book. So the main thing that we have whenever we come to looking at a survey is that there always are trade-offs when it comes to the design, the analysis, and the interpretation of the survey. In particular, taking these from the top, we have it is usually the case that when we're doing employee surveys, we approach it taking a uniform approach. Okay, so we create one survey, we push it out throughout the whole organization. There are lots of reasons for doing that. I mean, it makes the administration easy, it makes it efficient to be able to collect the data. There's one communication that goes out. We can have everyone aligned around doing one survey, and here's the purpose for it. And when it comes to doing interpretation, taking action from it, we can drive the same kind of process throughout the whole organization. The downside, though, is that when we take that approach, we lower the value that we can get from the survey because we usually have to make the survey so general so that it can apply across the whole organization and so we can have uniform processes. Second point, it's pretty common to create target thresholds excuse me, target thresholds for survey items. So you've got a % agree that you want to achieve for, say, compensation satisfaction or opportunities for development, job satisfaction, employee engagement, whatever it is you want to be focusing on. Those thresholds are something that we use to be able to draw people's attention, right? We might code something as red, yellow, or green, red for big urgency, yellow for something we want to worry about, and green for something is going just fine. Okay? Easy to communicate, easy to get people to act on and to try to hold them accountable, but the problem is that the way those are implemented are often off target in terms of what we want to be focusing on. A main point is that we often focus those on measures of employee engagement that come from an idea about what we think is important for keeping people engaged in the organization, but aren't necessarily built directly from the human capital strategy and where we need to be improving on the employee side in order to be able to have better organizational effectiveness. So they often are measures of things that could be important but aren't necessarily important. And in addition, when we start looking at thresholds for individual items, you have to ask the question of kind of how good is good enough and how high can we get the scores to be. and at what point do we need to be improving in other areas and not just on the attitudes that we have in our employee survey. Third main point is that there is a lot of external benchmarking that happens. It's very common for, for a company to use a survey vendor that will have a database with a large number of other companies available in it. That's usually one of the selling points. You can benchmark yourself against, similar organizations or roles outside your organization. That data is interesting, but unfortunately it's rarely actionable. Even if you see what is a statistically significant difference, or even a large meaningful difference between how you're performing and how another organization is performing on some survey measures, it doesn't mean that that necessarily is a gap that you need to fill, or if you're ahead of another organization that or the benchmark, that you should feel like you can be complacent and just keep things the way they are. Okay. All right. I was just noticing a comment. Well, I appreciate. I like the support. Thank you, Usman. Okay, so we want to go through these things each point one at a time. So first one, we'll talk about uniform survey versus taking a targeted or a more locally customized survey approach. So pros and cons on doing a uniform survey for everyone. On the pro side, everyone participates. This can be a very important way to rally people around a common objective, get the leadership to show that it cares about all employees in the organization, because we're going out there and we want to get their perspective. We want to hear from them. We want to, get their opinions and show that we care. On the downside, the measurements that actually matter for any given role, for a process in the organization, for a given location, a geography, or for the individual versus the group level, can matter significantly. Okay, so when we're talking about people who are working in very different kinds of roles, there can be very different kinds of issues that they have to respond to. When we're talking about different parts of the organization, different functions, different business units, or different geographies. And then finally, what's happening when we're talking about performance at the group level versus the individual level, the kinds of measurements that we need in order to understand what's driving behavior in each of those different ways is very different. Okay? When you design a survey that can be as universal as possible, you tend to focus it down on a smaller number of questions that can be applied to everybody, and that means you're taking a greatest common denominator approach. But that also means you tend to end up with a watered-down set of questions that can be important, but are not necessarily important for any one group in particular. Okay. So, specific kinds of differences that we have out there. If we think about role differences, what matters to senior executives versus machine operators, janitors, salespeople, R&D scientists, IT support can be very different. I mean, we know that everyone will say that compensation matters, but people who are senior executives, while they will complain a lot about their compensation and give people in the comp department a lot of headaches, the reality is that given their roles, given their power, given their prominence in the organization, it's often the case that in order to get better performance out of them, the answer is usually anything but compensation. Being able to keep them or not may be an issue around compensation, but rarely ever is an issue around kind of motivation and productivity. For other people, particularly people who live much closer to needing to worry about having to keep a roof over their head and putting a meal on the table, compensation can be much more important for them. Right? So understanding those differences is a key. Opportunities for development, kind of what people want from their careers or from the job, can vary a lot, not just across each person, but also from one role to another, one part of the organization to another. When it comes to process differences, okay, what do we need in terms of innovation, customer service, efficiency, quality? The ways that people contribute to each of those things and what the organization needs from them in order to be successful is different in the different cases. And when we think about a typical employee survey, we tend to think about measuring attitudes as things like, how do people feel satisfied with different parts of the job? But one of the greatest values that can come from a survey is also asking direct questions about what's happening on the process side. So if you're looking at your success at innovation, you can ask very specific questions around that, but the people that you need to get that information from to make informed decisions, is not going to be everybody in the organization. It's going to be the people who are most involved in that part of delivering innovation to the organization. Same thing around customer service, same thing around time to market, margins, quality. For each of those, there are going to be different parts of the organization that have much greater ability to be able to shed insights into what you need to know, and you want to target more specific questions toward them and not towards the whole organization. When it comes to geography, what we can accomplish at headquarters versus remote locations is often very different. I mean, at headquarters, there is usually a lot of process, a lot of inefficiency, but we can get away with it because people can walk down the hall and overcome the challenges that are being created. When you're at a more remote locations, they can be much more overwhelmed by what's getting pushed out from the center, and what they have to do to be able to be successful in those locations is different on a day-to-day basis than what you have to do at headquarters in order to succeed. So what you want to learn from a survey can be quite different for people who are sitting at headquarters versus remote locations. This is amplified even more when we talk about going out internationally, because then we're bringing in not just headquarters versus remote, but also large differences in terms of language, in terms of culture, and often even in terms of stages of economic development, which can make big differences in terms of what people expect in terms of careers from an organization, how they approach working in an organization like yours, et cetera. And then finally, we come to differences in terms of aggregation. A lot of the measures that we tend to put into surveys focus a lot on what we can measure at the individual level. So how do people feel about their supervisor, about the job, about their compensation, opportunities for development. There are a lot of measures that are out there that tend to get used less often on the typical employee survey that can measure things around group process. So how well is the group coming together to accomplish its objectives? How well are they collaborating? What kinds of support do they get from the organization overall? And depending on where you want to be focusing your improvement efforts. Do you want to be focusing them on having people feel engaged at the individual level one by one, or do you want to be focusing on better group process, better team dynamics? Depending on which one of those measures you want to be improving on, you'd want a different focus for the survey. Okay. So all of these differences, role differences, process differences, geography differences, and levels of aggregation, they create a differentiation that means that it's very difficult to have one survey that can do everything that we want it to do and be able to accomplish our goals. Okay. So the alternatives to doing a universal survey, first is to think about doing it less often. Okay. So instead of doing a universal survey, particularly if you've got, say, your annual employee survey, you can think about using that, reserving it for times when you need to really get the whole organization focused on a critical issue. Okay, so times of significant change, when you're thinking about assessing where the organization is along an evolution that you've been traveling. There's a great tendency for people to want to continue to do benchmarking to be able to monitor how things are going over time. But oftentimes we can make the case for taking a look at a smaller group of people, not necessarily everyone in the organization, in order to get the same. Very close to all the information you need in order to be able to make good, effective decisions. Think about looking at just surveying smaller units where the need for sensing is the greatest. So on the previous slide, we were looking at differences in role or differences in geography. If you want to understand, if the pressing critical issue right now is around, say, innovation or quality or customer service, there are going to be certain parts of the organization that can really give you much deeper insights into how to improve there. And doing a targeted survey of people in those parts of the organization is going to have much greater buy-in and people believing that it's a worthwhile effort when it's targeted where the data is going to tell you the most. If you want to stick with doing an organization-wide survey, think about taking a flexible approach. So you can have a small group of core questions that are for everyone, and by small I truly mean small, which is probably about a third the size of what many people consider to be their core questions on these surveys. And then think about saving the rest of the space on the survey for what you would address locally. So it's pretty common practice to have a large number of items, 40, 60 items that are asked for everybody, and then you give people in local business units or operating divisions say, a handful of questions they could ask themselves. Well, you could think about almost turning that in its head. What if you only asked, say, 20 or 25 questions that were core for everybody, and then you left a space for, say, 30 or so questions that could be adapted locally. If you take that kind of approach, you can have much greater insights that can enable each part of the business to look at things that are most important for them. Now, that, of course, is also much harder to administer, which is one of the reasons why we don't see that approach taken very often. But it could be a pretty strong antidote for the kind of apathy we see develop around employee surveys, where particularly annual ones, where people take a look at it and say, oh, we're doing this again, and what has actually changed since last year, where the answer is usually very little. So the bottom line is that doing an organization-wide survey is easier to administer, but it's not necessarily more valuable than taking one of these other alternative approaches. And again, I would encourage people as we go along, if there are any questions. Oh, okay, I see some questions here. Okay, so one question here. What sort of reactions or questions do you typically get when you've covered these upfront points with other audiences? So I would say that I get a little bit of pushback. I mean, there is a lot of people like to do what they see as being common practice that's out there. But what I also see is that people are pretty acutely aware of the drawbacks of taking the typical kind of survey approaches that are out there. And so when they're shown alternatives that can actually get to deeper insights, they're often pretty receptive. Second question is, I like the hybrid approach, but are there vendors who will help administer given a large organization scalability challenges? The answer to that is, if you go out and you scan the different vendors that are out there, it's probably not going to be listed as something that's part of their core offerings. What I see from these survey vendors is that they're geared towards selling a product where you can do quick and universal reporting back, where you can drill down to lots of different levels. And so they've built these survey machines that can enable you to do that in a relatively cost-effective way. What that means is that if you take the kind of approach I'm talking about, you'll probably end up spending more than you would for a single administration for one of those annual surveys, but recognize that in those cases they're usually selling something where they're planning on getting an annuity stream, right? They're planning on getting your business year after year after year. If you do one of the more flexible approach, then you don't necessarily would need to field that survey every year, at least not the localized versions. And if you did it every 18 months or every 2 years, what you save from not doing it every 12 months, you could then invest back into having it be a more customized thing that you do with the localized approaches. I know that the larger companies with the more kind of robust IT capability, I'm sure can build these things. It's actually not that difficult. It's just the same thing as having different versions of a survey used in the different parts of the organization, which is not too much different than, say, having different language versions where you're sending different links to different people. So it's actually relatively straightforward to do. It's just not necessarily how they market their services. Another question. Using vendors may be helpful in org-wide large surveys. Must we use them for focused internal surveys also? And the answer is you don't ever have to use an outside vendor. The only issue becomes when you're talking about doing things internally versus externally is how important confidentiality is and anonymity, and whether or not people will feel comfortable giving you the responses that you want by doing the survey internally. I mean, if you still need to preserve confidentiality or anonymity and you're worried about people not giving you forthright responses, if you administer this survey internally, there are alternatives to using the big survey vendors because there are other smaller survey organizations out there that you could use for more tailored effort. Okay, so second point, what is the best focus for reporting and taking action? So target scores. It is when we establish target scores or thresholds for survey scores, it's very easy to communicate and create accountability. I mean, whoever thought up the graphic of coding things as red, yellow, and green for taking action on a survey, I think was pretty ingenious. Of course, there are cultural issues here after we go outside of the U.S. because, in the U.S. we all know what red, yellow, and green mean, but that doesn't necessarily translate internationally. But the point being that whatever kind of language you use for what is a high priority versus lower priority versus not so important for improving on, it is a very effective tool to be able to kind of take different parts of the survey and say, here's what we want to focus on, here's what we don't. And I actually think that that's a fine thing to do. The issue, though, is where those come from, okay? And what do you do, and what is your purpose for doing it? What I've seen is that there tends to be a pretty arbitrary choice of saying that we want to achieve a certain amount of percent agree, whether it's 75% or 80% or whatever it might be, and that anything that is above that threshold we say we're doing fine on. Anything that is, say, right around or just below are areas for slight improvement. Any things that are, where there's a big gap are the areas for high priority improvement. The problem with that is that where that comes from is based on some kind of notion that it is good to be at like 80%. But it's rarely chosen based on multivariate modeling. Multivariate modeling is a way of taking the data that we collect on surveys and actually asking what matters the most for moving people's opinions. I mean, how people feel about their compensation, how they feel about their development opportunities, their relationship with their supervisor, et cetera, et cetera. Those things matter when they actually have an impact on people's motivation and productivity. So how does it impact their intention to turnover? How does it impact their commitment to the organization? How does it impact things like the shared understanding and commitment we have for people to work together in teams? The only way you can answer that is by running a multivariate model and looking at what's actually driving the behavior and motivation for the people that you're looking at. Even better is when you run different models for different parts of the organization. I don't want to, thinking back to the role differences that we were talking about a little while ago, I don't want to use the same criteria for deciding, what's driving a senior executive's motivation versus administrative assistants or people who are the research scientists. Depending on what the role is, what they're doing in the organization, you may want to actually run a different multivariate model to understand what are the particular things that we're measuring that are going to make the biggest difference in terms of people's commitment and wanting to stay with the organization. Okay. Typical measures of employee engagement that are pushed by a lot of the consulting companies may be important. You can certainly make fairly strong arguments for why they should be important, but just because something should be important doesn't mean that if we make an improvement on that it's going to actually make a difference to getting people to be more committed to staying with the organization and to giving us higher productivity. We don't know that without doing the modeling. Okay, let me pause here. Okay, a question that came through was, this is getting back to the previous points. If you don't survey everyone, would some employees feel left out? The answer is yes. However, the purpose of an employee survey is not to get everybody to feel like their voice is heard necessarily. If you're not willing to act on what you're measuring, then it's better not to ask people at all. If the purpose is to want to understand how happy people are, you can get there using a small number of questions. If you want to understand what's actually driving behavior and motivation and performance in different parts of the organization, it's very difficult to do that with a global survey without getting to more targeted questions. So I'm all for including everybody in the survey, but only if you can make sure that you can use their data for good purposes. Next question that came through. Have you seen surveys that automatically populate custom questions based on multiple employee dimensions? So I don't know about a particular, say, survey software that would do that, but what I have seen, which is a fairly common approach, is when you're, particularly when you look at global surveys, when you're surveying people in different parts of the world, it's very typical to offer different options for what kinds of questions they're going to be filling out. There also are surveys. It's very common these days to have surveys where you can do branching. So depending on what question someone fills out, like how they respond to one question, they might get a different question. You could do branching based, for example, on what role someone has or what part of the organization they are, where the branching then becomes going and filling out a whole different survey. So these things are actually, they are technologically feasible, even if it's not something that is offered by every survey company that's out there. For multivariate modeling, what is your experience in terms of correlation between questions within the employee satisfaction surveys? They're not exactly always scientific proof. Okay, so the question here is around kind of how do you approach doing this? When we talk about multivariate modeling, what we're doing is going and using a regression model or an ANOVA, analysis of variance, to tell us, it's like a horse race, to have the statistics tell us what are the things that matter the most for driving people's commitment, loyalty, retention, whatever it is we're trying to measure. It is pretty common for people to kind of look at things one measure at a time and say, oh, something might be highly correlated with intention to turnover, therefore we want to focus on it. You actually want to be doing a multivariate model so you can be comparing all things at the same time. That is a better approach than just doing it one variable at a time. Let me see here. Okay, I got another question about how many variables to include. For those people who want to ask more kind of very specific technical questions around how complex you want to make a multivariate model, I'm happy to follow up separately if you want to send me a note. What I will say for everyone on the call is when it comes to doing multivariate modeling, there's both kind of an art and a science to it. So you want to make sure that you don't put in too many things that can make it difficult to try to differentiate what's really driving people's behavior. It's one of the reasons why you need to be careful to make sure that the people who you work with to do this work for you actually know what they're doing. We're getting to the point now where the IT providers are making it easier and easier, whether this is through your HRIS system or some kind of analytics package you might have that's overlaid on top of it. It's getting easier and easier to do advanced statistical analysis, even if you don't have experience running the models. And what I'd say is that there's a lot more to doing these analyses than just pushing some buttons in some software and looking at the output that comes out. You want to actually have someone be involved, whether it's someone inside your organization or from outside, who has experience running these things and knowing how to look at them so that they can help make sure that whatever models you set up, you're doing to get the deepest insights, and you're not going to make the same kinds of mistakes that people have made over and over again when they start doing these kinds of analyses and come across the kinds of dead ends that often are the case, when you're learning a new field. Okay. Will I be sharing examples of multivariate analyses I found most helpful? There actually are some case studies that I've completed and others at the center have done that we can. I'd be happy to send along if you want to send an email or contact Carrie. We can send along copies of some of those write-ups for those of you who'd like to see examples of those multivariate analyses. Final question on this one is, what modeling platform do you typically use? Me being a little more of a kind of traditional researcher on these things, I tend to use ones that are they're designed for the power of the statistical analysis and less for the ease of use by the end user. So for myself, it might be SPSS or Stata or SAS, but it's different. I wouldn't necessarily recommend those for people who don't have a lot of experience with them. And again, I would encourage people to you want to consult with somebody who is got a lot of experience doing these things and not just try to do it on your own. Okay, great. So let me go on to our next slide. So when we think about the question about target scores, one of the challenges that people have is that when they're trying to think about making improvements, there, this idea about we've got, a certain percentage number that we're trying to achieve on a survey, it sounds really, really enticing to say, well, if we're sitting at 75%, then it must be better to be able to go to say 80%. Or if we're at 80%, do we want to get higher? The problem is that, think about taking that to the extreme. If somebody came to you and said, we want to get to the point where we get 100% agreement on one of the items that we're measuring in the survey, your immediate response to them should be, well, that's of course silly. The only way you're going to get to 100% agreement is if you ask a question that is so obvious that it's so non-controversial that everyone will agree with it. Like, should we have world peace? The whole point of doing the measurements on these surveys is that we want to be able to look at things that actually matter for people, measuring things where if we could make an improvement, then people could be happier. But there is a limit to how much people are going to how much we're going to be able to get in terms of percentage agree. While it may be uncomfortable for people, for people in leadership, I actually think there'd be even greater value for including more items for things that would be, say, even more controversial, have even more differentiation. Because then you have more room for improvement. If you've got a bunch of items where everything you're measuring is already up towards 80%, the value of going up by a couple more percentage points is questionable, both in terms of what does the measurement actually mean, but also from the perspective of what is it that's actually important for driving the business. Okay, what we measure on these surveys is not necessarily the things that matter for driving the business. And that's about both looking at the multivariate models of what's actually driving people's behavior. Okay, so when we've got for example, compensation satisfaction is something where you're never going to get extremely high scores because we know that that's something that people are never going to be 100% happy with. And yet for some people, being able to move from, say, 60% satisfied to 65 might be much more important for the business than moving a different measure from, say, 80 to 85%. Or some, it's just, talking about these in theoretical is very hard to do. When you look at any particular role at a different part of the organization, you can get a much more clear view about what's important for the people in that role in that part of the organization, and that tells you what you want to focus on. All right, so final point is, what does it mean for people, actually, I take that back. I want to go back and make one more point about engagement. Okay. One of the points that we hear a lot about these days is people talking about what makes for engaged employees and why employee engagement is important for performance. What we've seen through lots of work over the years and from working directly with companies, this is both our experience at the center, and then we see with our other colleagues who do research and also are out there and working as practitioners, is that you have many different things that contribute to organizational performance, and what we measure in employee attitudes on a survey are often things that go hand in hand with organizational performance. So they can be correlated with how the organization is performing. So one of the reasons why we have organizations like Gallup and others who say we should be focusing so much on employee engagement and why we see it tracks performance so well is because, as Ed has pointed out in his writings, and this goes back many years, when you have people who are engaged in the work, who are involved, who are being productive and performing, there's a virtuous spiral that takes place where better organizational performance helps to encourage people to be more engaged. When they're engaged, they're contributing more, and you tend to see those things go hand in hand. But the employee engagement that we measure in our surveys is usually a coincident indicator of business performance. It's actually not a leading indicator of business performance. And so when we're measuring these things and then we turn around and we say to managers, we want to hold you accountable for for what we see coming out of the survey. It's okay to do that if you want to make sure they're being good managers and they're helping to treat their employees well. But having the expectation that improving the scores you see on the survey will necessarily improve your business performance is actually putting the cart before the horse. There are a lot of things that you can do to improve scores on an employee survey that will have no positive impact on organizational performance, and some you could do that might even have a negative impact. I mean, you can make people happier by reducing their demands and keeping their compensation the same. That'll certainly make them happier. It would reduce their workload, improve their work-life balance, reduce their stress, give them more time to spend with their on different projects. But that would totally ruin your business model. To essentially keep people paid the same, but then reduce everyone's demands by a huge amount. So that's obviously something that we don't think about doing. We're talking about improving scores, but it's kind of the extreme case to prove the point that if you just focus people's efforts on improving scores on surveys without thinking about what is it you actually need to do to improve business performance, you're really focusing in the wrong direction. All right, so now on to our final point. Okay, so when is a survey result meaningful? Okay, now, one of the benefits that is often sold by people both inside and outside our organization, so the people who are responsible for implementing the employee survey, for hiring a vendor, and also the people on the outside who are selling the services, is the value of benchmarking. Okay? Now, benchmarking is absolutely important for organizational performance. When we're talking about things on the customer side, on the business process side, benchmarking is one of the critical ways that we know whether or not we're performing well compared to our competitors. Okay? Whether it comes to quality, customer service, how we're performing in terms of market share, margins, innovation, time to market, all of those different measures are things that determine whether or not we're going to live or die as an organization in the marketplace. This is unequivocally true. So when we take that idea of benchmarking, and now we take it from external benchmarking and now look at, say, external benchmarking of what we're doing on the business side, to then look at external benchmarking of what we're doing on the people side, unfortunately, the logic doesn't flow. Okay? What causes people to respond the way they do to the questions on the survey has as much, if not much more so, to do with what is the experience they have internally, the sum total of their experiences internally. It has much more to do with that than it does with how we compare on any one measure, whether it's around compensation, around development, around opportunities for promotion, whatever it might be. And so the problem is that if you look one question at a time and you ask, how are we performing relative to some external benchmark on those particular questions for an employee survey, you can end up with a pretty distorted view of what it is you should focus on. So let's say that you score lower on compensation but higher on opportunities for promotion. What does that mean? I mean, does that mean that you are, you should be worried? Should you be satisfied? And the answer is we don't know without looking more carefully. In particular, are those differences created by differences in the kinds of people that you're hiring, differences in what you can realistically offer people? I mean, if you're in an industry where you've got let's say you're talking about a unit that is a lot smaller than the benchmark that's out there. Okay, so and you've got much fewer opportunities for promotion than those other organizations are showing up. You may not ever be able to close that gap. I mean, if you're talking about a series of smaller sites where people would have to change locations in order to be able to get a promotion, and they're very happy working where they are, you may have relatively, kind of small opportunities for promotion just because of the kind of business you're running. Versus if you're comparing yourself against sites that are, 5 times the size, where people have much more room for internal mobility, what you'd be measuring there when you look at a difference in opportunities for promotion is actually differences in your business model. And if differences in the business model are driving differences in what people are seeing in their opportunities for promotion, then that's not necessarily something we want to worry about. It doesn't mean that we should ignore it, not necessarily, but it's something that you want to make sure you know what's actually driving that difference. Differences in compensation can be driven by many different factors, including how long people have been a part of the organization, how much you do internal, how much you benchmark to the external marketplace and make adjustments. And even if there are differences in say, satisfaction with compensation, at the end of the day, the question is, do they matter? And what is the entire picture? So what are people getting in terms of compensation, opportunities for promotion, ability to be able to develop in place, to learn, to have interesting work, to have supervisor relationships that make them happy and want to come to work, to have the right kind of workload. All of these things contribute to people's feelings about the workplace and their motivation and productivity. And you can't look at any one of them on their own, and particularly how you compare it outside, and decide if something is good or bad just based on that one benchmark comparison. Okay? So this is yet another reason for thinking about doing multivariate modeling and focusing on what are the drivers that actually matter for a particular group of people or part of the organization you're looking at. Okay, so here's a question. So focusing on a top 10 item or bottom 10 item list without a multivariate look could be missing the big picture then. The answer is absolutely yes. I mean, the whole idea of coming up with a top 10 or bottom 10 item list, if you're doing that just by looking at the raw scores and kind of the average scores that are coming out of surveys and not knowing what's actually driving people's behavior, you could end up really focusing your attention in the wrong direction. Okay. So when is the difference actually meaningful? If we see a difference in scores, a related question is that difference big enough to worry about? Okay. Now, something which many of you may know directly or have heard about, which is often in the background when we're looking at the reports that we get from survey vendors or different parts of the organization do analysis. You might get this from sales or marketing. When someone says that there is a difference in numbers that's meaningful, the first criteria that is used is statistical significance. Statistical significance is something that statistical significance is an actual technical term that tells you can we reliably conclude that there is a difference between two numbers. Now, something that not everybody is aware of is that the larger the sample that you have, so the larger the number of people that you're using for comparing across two different groups, the larger the number is between the two different groups, the greater the chances that you're going to get a statistically significant difference. Okay. So if I'm comparing two different groups, one that's got 15 people, one that has 20 people, and I've got two different mean scores of 52% versus say 55%, I've only got if I have less than 30 people in each of those two groups, the statistics are probably going to come out and say that 52% versus 55% is not actually significantly different. And if it isn't, then in fact we shouldn't conclude that those are different numbers. If we multiply those numbers by 1,000, so now we're comparing groups of say 25,000 and 28,000 people, and we get the same percentages of 52% versus 55, the statistics will come back and almost always say that that is a statistically significant difference. And that's simply because when you've got more and more people that you're using to estimate what a number is, the larger the group gets, the more certain we can be that what we're looking at is a difference, meaning it's a real difference. But just because it's a real difference in a statistical sense doesn't necessarily mean that it's a meaningful difference that we should act on. Okay? So, first thing is you want to think about how are things trending over time. Even with those large numbers, you can get numbers on these surveys that will go up by up or down by 1, 2, or 3 percentage points from one year to the next. I have seen, quite a few organizations where they will get very animated over those kinds of changes, and the challenge becomes, what do you do about it? I mean, if you see numbers change by 2 or 3% one year, and you extrapolate from that and you say, wow, if we keep on going the same direction, we could end up doing extremely well if they're going up, or let's say they're going down. You might think, wow, if we keep on going down by the same rate, things are going to get really bad and we need to act on it. So I'm all for people wanting to be concerned and to making sure that you're on top of a potential change that could make a big difference if it keeps going. But this is actually an argument not so much for making a big change off of what you see change from one year to the next in an annual survey. It's actually an argument for for figuring out specific measurements you want to look at that you think are really critical for monitoring for the business. And if they're that important that you're worried about things changing by 2 or 3%, go in and do more frequent pulse surveys, say, twice a year or 3 or 4 times a year, so you can get really good trend data. And then if you see things start to change, say from one quarter to the next, and they continue in changing, so like let's say they change in the first quarter relative to the fourth quarter from the previous year, we see the same kind of change go into the second quarter and then to the third, that's reason enough to say you want to act, as opposed to kind of a one-time change when you're looking from one year to the next on an annual survey. So that's one point, is around kind of looking at trends and seeing what's going on. The other is to recognize that depending on what's happening in the organization, it may be quite reasonable for things to change and to become negative in ways that make a lot of sense. Obviously, if there's a turnaround situation, scores are going to go down. When you do a reorganization, and those are the kinds of contexts where people usually accept it and say, yes, we understand scores went down, but then they have an expectation for how much they should go up again. Well, when you do a turnaround, when you do a reorganization, where the organization ends up eventually is not in the same place it started. And so having an expectation that scores are necessarily going to get back to where they were before may not be realistic, and maybe setting people up to focus on the wrong thing. I don't have perhaps a very satisfying answer here, but there's no objective way of being able to say, well, we should be able to get back to the exact same scores on an employee survey after there's been any kind of a significant organizational change. So you shouldn't put yourself into fits trying to get back to the same place if there are reasonable reasons why you may not be able to get there. Now, does this mean that you ignore why scores went down? No. You want to make sure that you're focusing on them, but recognize that what you can measure in the survey is only a snapshot. It's only part of what you really need to know in order to figure out, is everything happening the way you want it to. Okay, there's a question here. Sorry, a couple questions. Okay. How much do you worry about margin of error, especially as you drill down into business unit survey scores? Our overall margin of error is less than 1% and struggle with whether we should even show reports that have a margin of error greater than 10%. Yet we are always asked for drill down scores. At what point is drilling down doing a disservice? Okay, so this question here is precisely about the point around the statistical significance. So how big a difference has to be in order to be statistically significant. So that difference becomes larger as the groups get smaller. And so as you drill down further into the organization to smaller and smaller groups, what is a statistically significant difference at a larger level can become totally insignificant as you go down. I think it's a real concern, but it also raises the question of what are people doing with the drill downs? Okay, if you have a really compelling reason for measuring what you're measuring and holding people accountable, and you want to get people to act on that data, then drill downs can be entirely appropriate. But you perhaps want to actually tell them what is the, do you end up with differences that are meaningful or not? If they're not meaningful, then even if it looks like they might be big numbers, then that has to be part of the conversation. So there is actually no substitute for engaging people in conversations. So bringing the organization development side of this into survey analysis, of making sure that you're not just giving people data, but helping them to be able to interpret it and act upon it appropriately when it comes to things like drill downs. Okay. Next question. When the year-to-year comparison of the surveys is done, should we also take a look at the external benchmarking that would take care of any unforeseen changes in the market or environmental conditions? So I'm all for always considering any kinds of data that you have available to you. So if you have external benchmark data that tells you that there's been a big change, if there's been a big change in the external environment, and you see other organizations changing in a similar kind of way, you should definitely take that into consideration, but recognize that there are different organizations are able to deal with changes in the external environment, better or worse than others. And so let's say that your scores are, stay about the same relative to the benchmark, but that in fact you had much worse. You were hit much worse in terms of, say, loss of revenue, or different or more competitors coming into your local market. If you were able to maintain about the same score relative to the external benchmark, even though externally things are going much worse for you in your business, that actually is a sign that you probably did better than your competitors in terms of how you dealt with everything. We could also come up with a flip side where, let's say you performed marginally better compared to the benchmark, but you also had an easier time in terms of what was happening externally. People could say, oh, well, we performed really well, when in fact it was just the luck of the draw. And that you perhaps should have been doing even better given what was happening on the customer side. So I'm all for looking at the external benchmark data, but recognizing that you need to have a lot more information in order to be able to figure out, is it actionable and where you can let yourselves off the hook versus hold yourselves accountable using it. Okay. So getting to the last couple of points on the slide here. When we think about looking at kind of differences over time and what does it mean to have this benchmark data, anytime we grow as an organization, the growth alone and the complexity that it brings along makes managing much harder. I've been working with an organization quite recently that in fact saw a very large drop in its scores at the same time that it went through a merger. And the merger, they actually had benchmark data for each of the individual, the separate organizations before the merger, and then they all came together. And what they found is that the overall scores fell pretty dramatically after the merger. Now, one reason for that most likely is because they were not 100% successful in the merger. There were some challenges they still have to overcome, and they recognize that. But another aspect is when they did that merger, they then became a much larger organization, which made it harder to manage, and they actually became larger than many of the benchmark organizations that they were being compared to. So this is an industry where there are a lot of smaller groups that are out there, and they became a much bigger fish in the pond. And then in that context, when you're looking at people who are looking at things like confidence in leadership or how much their voice is being heard, how much they can influence what takes place in the organization, what happened in this organization is they went from being an apples to apples comparison to being almost an apples to oranges comparison. So they were no longer the same kind of organization as what they were being compared to in the benchmark, and so it raises very important questions about should they ever expect to get back to where they were before in terms of people feeling connection and confidence in leadership and all that. And one of the tough questions they're now trying to figure out is how should they reset their expectations around what those survey outcomes should be. Okay. Excuse me. And then, so the final point in all of this is that given the challenges of doing benchmarking externally and even doing benchmarking internally, right? So let's say we have an overall score for employee engagement or whatever measure you're looking at on the survey. We got an overall score for the organization. There's going to be how people respond in different roles, different parts of the organization, can happen in ways that make perfect sense that have to do with who they are, with the kinds of opportunities that are available to them, and that's just part of kind of the DNA of the organization and the work design. And I don't want to necessarily look at those differences and say that they matter so much. What I care more about is looking at people in the same role or in the same business unit or the same function over time and seeing how are we doing compared to where things were like in the past for that group. And that's the most reliable kind of benchmarking that we can do. So that's it in terms of the prepared remarks that I had. there are any other questions, you should feel free to send them through. While I'm we're giving people another kind of minute or two to think about it here, I just want to remind you I do have a program I'll be doing on the topic of targeted analytics, which is coming up in February. And the content that's part of the book that's going to be coming out and that we covered here is one of the modules that will be part of that program. The larger set of questions that we address there is around how to be more analytical in the decision-making that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, how to bring analytics in and to make the right choices, in two different kinds of settings, both where we have enough data and time to be able to do a deep analysis, and how can we do better database decision-making even when there isn't time for doing deep analytics, and then how to use analysis to lead change, and how to use things like systems diagnostics and multivariate models to be able to get to deeper insights. Okay, so one other question here. We moved away from doing 2-box reporting or percent satisfied reporting, and instead use factor analysis, groupings, and percentile reporting against internal business unit measures. This helps in measures where 100% or even 60% is not achievable. It has helped people move away from looking at the lowest score and assuming that this is the area to automatically do action planning around. They're now appreciative of the models that we built to substantiate our employee engagement model. So this is coming from a contributor from Lane, who basically has, I guess, followed this advice. So I didn't. This isn't a plant. This is somebody who I knew would make this contribution. But so one of the listeners on the call is actually saying that they've had this kind of experience where they used to do reporting around getting people to focus on percent agree, and realize that that wasn't the best way to get to actionable insights. So they implemented this approach of doing more modeling of what's actually driving people's behavior internally, and they've been able to get the business to buy in and take action off of it. So thank you, Lane, for that example. That's a really great one. If you have any other questions, happy to contact me separately, and let me turn it back over now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar, and hope you'll tune into future webinars and also attend some of our events. Please look at our website listed here on this page for further information about the center. For those of you who'd like to explore sponsorship or a particular research project, we're always happy to talk to you. So give us a call, send us an email, take a look at the website. Thanks again to Alec for a terrific presentation and for all the questions. It was very interactive. It was a pleasure to hear so many questions coming up.